Excellent. Just give me a countdown. Yeah. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Planet Data 3 from ODI Leeds. Something that's very close to our hearts here at ODI Leeds, and this is our response to the climate emergency. We've got a load of friends, we've got a load of sponsors, we've got a load of people from all over the world who are going to talk to you this morning about their response to the climate emergency and how they're using data in that and how they are accelerating their work and others' work to really make a difference. So you can find Planet Data if you just go to odileeds.org on our website, click the link, but then you can also find the Planet Data 1 and Planet Data 2 there, all the talks we've had previously and all our work that we've done around the climate emergency. Planet Data 1 was part of Leeds Digital Festival in person in 2019. Here at ODI Leeds, in the space, nearly 100 people in the room and lots of people online watching our work. Planet Data 2 was part of the Leeds Digital Festival in 2020 in April, the virtual digital festival, and our Planet Data 3 is a completely online event that we've put on. And like a lot of businesses, we've had to adapt and take ourselves online and basically turn the gather, which you see behind me, into a broadcast studio. So we've also looked at how you operate and how you work on the web and how you do events. So we've not tried to create an in-person event on the web, we tried to build an event that is on the web and how you can link, learn, share, and also get involved in what we do. So if you are online and you see the chat feature, which has been built by the ODI Leeds team, please, when you're asking questions of our speakers, if you could just put your name in, let us know who you are and what your question is, and we'll pick them up at the end of each talk. So, Leeds Digital Festival has been an integral part of what ODI Leeds has done and is going to do in the future. And we'd like to thank them and Stuart Clark and everyone in the team at Leeds Digital Festival for really making a difference and allowing us to experiment and do really interesting work and also share that across the region, the country, and I know Stuart talks a lot about the international and global impact of the festival. So today we've got speakers from Leeds, from Cambridge, from London, from Stockholm, from Manchester, covering lots of aspects of how people are responding to the climate emergency, what they're doing together, how they're collaborating and making a difference by being radically open. Of course, that makes us very happy when they are radically open. So as an optimist, I'm really positive about these talks, because when you look at them, the level of work, the ambition, the difference they're making makes me feel that we have a chance of actually beating the risks that we all see around the climate emergency. So the way today works is we've got lightning talks, some short, some long, from all different types of people who are working on the climate emergency. If you've got a question, just put it in the chat. We'll pick them up at the end, and most of the speakers are going to join us at the end for a video Q&A, where they'll get to pick up any of the points that you raise, some of the points that we raise, and then we'll record all that so you can share that in the future with other people, and also get in touch with the people who are talking. So first up is Gavin Starks from Icebreaker One. We're really happy to be working with Icebreaker One on their Project Cygnus, which you can find out on the website. It's all there. And Gavin's going to tell you about his ambition, the ambition for Icebreaker One, and how they are going to make a difference by creating data infrastructure for the response to the climate emergency. Over to Gavin.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Gavin Starks. I'm the founder of Icebreaker One. I want to just introduce you to some of the work that we're embarking on, and introduce you to some of our team who will go into a bit more detail of each of the programs. Icebreaker One is here to help bridge the data gaps between climate change and finance. And so we're looking at how do we better apply our environmental intelligence through data into the financial community and beyond. We've got a number of different programs, but really what we're here to do is to try and help instrument net zero. And that involves not just getting access to the data, but it involves connecting our policy with risk management and with investment, so that at the point of investment, an investor could mandate the data flows to demonstrate net zero at the point of design, at the point of construction, operation, and decommissioning of any project. You know, we spend trillions of dollars per annum on our infrastructure, and all of that needs to be demonstrably net zero in order that everybody can hit their targets of net zero. In the UK, obviously, our target here is 2050 as a legally binding target. Getting there is going to be difficult, and we want to help it be a provable journey. In order to do that, we're bringing together different organizations. We're working across the public and the private sector. So here we're helping businesses and markets evolve to enable collaboration, to accelerate the use of data sharing. In order to do that, rather than just say, well, if we bring the data to market, magic will happen, we're saying that we've really got to be focused on the user needs. So there's a strand here on product innovation. We're really helping companies work out what products they can take to market and what data then supports those products. In the context of Icebreaker's role, we're here to help bring people together across sectors. So we're also looking at the market efficiencies and the data infrastructure governance across markets that will enable data sharing between companies that may not want to share information or deal with data rights, data protection, security, and related issues. That then takes us into the policy realm, and so we're creating policy interventions and recommendations along the way. We've got three major projects. One is called SERI, which is a standard for environmental risk and insurance. There we're partnered with Aon, Arup, Bird & Bird on the insurance, on the legal side, Brit Insurance, Lloyd's Register Foundation, University of Cambridge, and Willis Towers Watson. And the target there is to try and create a climate-ready financial product. Second project is Project Cygnus, which is how can we finance net zero recovery, net zero economic recovery from the COVID crisis that we're currently in. And the third project is Open Energy, where we're taking the principles that have already been applied in open banking, which is a national standard in the UK, to the energy sector, and can we enable energy data sharing across the entire market. So I'm going to pass over now to Nick, who can tell us a bit more about Project Cygnus. Nick.
Thank you, Gavin. I'm Nick Tyrone. I'm the Research Director of Project Cygnus, which, as Gavin explained, is about trying to find out how we can come out of the COVID recovery period economically in a way that is net zero, that meets net zero targets. So I've looked at the research. I'm sort of doing it in three strands. The first one is very much around data, given it falls within the very much the Icebreaker 1 sort of world, which is what data do we have around around this subject, and what data do we not have? So looking at the data that we have, and obviously using that data as best as possible to go through the other two streams, which I'll explain in a moment, but then also identifying where we don't seem to have the data, which I think is actually equally as important to find out. The second stream is to try and paint a picture of what a COVID recovery economically would look like, and then obviously how we can make that as green and sustainable as possible. So basically just an overview of that world. And then out of that, we hope to get the third one, which will be our policy recommendations. So that's the how bit, that's the real policy bit, which is how do we achieve net zero from a green COVID recovery. And so that's what I'm doing on Project Cygnus. Project Cygnus is also has a partnership with the University College Dublin and an organization called GovCo. And they're going to be doing some more of the data bits as well. There's a whole huge amount of data that we are creating around this. As I say, my bit is to kind of sort of take that data and come out at the end with some policy recommendations around how we actually make we take advantage of the situation, which is COVID has put us into a crisis, but we're going to need some economic plan to get out of it. It's now time to make it as sustainable, as green as possible. And so that's what Project Cygnus is all about.
Thank you, Nick. We'll come back to some questions at the end there too. So moving forward here onto open energy, if I pass over to Miles.
Hi, thank you, Gavin. So Open Energy is a competition. It's sponsored by Innovate UK. Actually, it's the Modernising Energy Data Access competition, and Icebreaker already won the first phase. We're into the second phase now, where we are head-to-head with Siemens. And what we're doing is somewhat different to Siemens. They are doing a kind of central gateway. We are doing a distributed architecture based on open banking, learning from open banking, looking how we can repurpose that very same infrastructure and same approach to make it really work well for the energy market. It's all about creating an ecosystem. Now, we've already seen this and learning from open banking how hundreds of companies have come in to create some really, really interesting, innovative solutions which address real customer needs, address the issues around financial inclusion and so on. Now, we think we can take exactly the same approach and use that to hasten the move, the drive towards decarbonising the energy system in the UK. And what's going on at the moment is that actually we're moving from a very centralised system to a very decentralised system. So it's perfect timing, if you like. What we can do is start to unlock the huge amount of data that exists across the energy network, and start to use that in a way that allows us to solve some of the very compelling problems that we're faced with at the moment. And we'll do that by basically creating a standard and a governance platform that allows all this to flourish. It's really about encouraging organizations and startups, entrepreneurs to come to the party and to start thinking about how we can actually address a much more efficient energy system, but also how we can turn that into something which has economic benefit, societal benefit, and of course meets this end goal of decarbonising. So this is about an open standard then that allows this kind of marketplace to flourish. We are very much into trying to make sure this becomes as interoperable and cohesive as possible, and that means interoperable between different sectors as well. There's no reason why you couldn't have solutions which draw on data coming from different sectors, banking being an obvious one. We can start to see use cases around that. But actually trying to leverage this massive investment that's already been made in this fantastic infrastructure. What the open banking infrastructure allows you to do is to create a trusted environment where you can be really, really confident about who the players are. So if I'm going to share data with some other service, how do I know who that person is, who that organization is? How can I be confident that I'm sharing the right data, and that's going to be managed securely and effectively. And the open banking infrastructure has been designed to do exactly that. And now we will repurpose that for the energy sector. And really this is what all that is about. And to do that, we have two work streams. One which is very much around understanding user needs, policy, operations, and the technical aspects, where we're bringing together a large number of stakeholders to help provide guidance, make sure that we're on track, take feedback from the industry, and ensure that what we actually create meets specifically the needs of the energy industry. And the second work stream is creating a prototype itself. And for that, we are looking at creating the governance platform. We're looking at search and discovery, so you can find the data that you need. We are intending to create a mocked up service, so we can basically populate the data within a mock-up service provider, and we're working on getting a reference customer for it, so you can see the whole thing end to end. So it's a very exciting project, could have major impact on efficiency and decarbonisation across the UK. And I would urge you to sign up for the Icebreaker Energy Cluster to stay in touch with everything that we're doing there. Back to you, Gavin.
Thanks, Miles. Really exciting projects. We'll come back to some more questions at the end on that as well. But let's move forward here with our final bit of the jigsaw. Jana.
So SERI is the standard for environmental risk and insurance, and the rationale behind focusing on the insurance industry, I think, as Gavin puts it, is that insurance is one of the hardest pieces of the financial services infrastructure puzzle to solve when it comes to delivering the financial capabilities we need to enable net zero. So the purpose of SERI is twofold. Firstly, it's to work with the insurance industry and wider stakeholders to create climate-ready insurance products, and I'll get onto the definition of climate-ready in a minute. And then secondly, it's also to identify and deliver the shared data infrastructure that will enable them. And it's really important when we talk about shared data infrastructure to emphasize that we are not looking at defining new data standards here. There are many very useful data standards in existence, and it's quite a crowded space. What we want to do is to actually, in the same way as Miles described open energy and taking principles from open banking, we want to develop the infrastructure for actually exposing and sharing data that adheres to existing or new standards in the future. So when we talk about climate-ready insurance products, what do we mean by climate-ready? So climate-ready is defined as, firstly, something that delivers net zero or enables a move towards net zero. And secondly, addresses the consequences of climate change through greater resilience and adaptation. And within SERI, we are very much more focused on the first prong of that definition, which is creating insurance products that will enable delivery of net zero objectives. And the second, which is addressing the consequences of climate change, is more to do with physical risk and is more nice to have. So taking all this and putting it together, and a climate-ready insurance product is one which incentivizes climate-ready behaviors on the part of the buyers of insurance, or also could enable them to bring to market products or technologies that are themselves climate-ready. So examples of these in terms of incentivizing climate-ready behaviors could include things like for example, flood insurance type products that incentivize the buyers of insurance to actually flood-proof their homes in the future, and also use sustainable technologies in doing so, or else enabling net zero enabling technologies such as wind turbines, electric vehicles, and other renewable energy sources. So the program started on the 1st of April and it runs until the 31st, or this initial phase runs until the 31st of March 2021. And it's split across 3 work streams. which are all quite fairly interdependent. So the Product Innovation Working Group is exploring insurance product innovation across a number of areas, including renewable energy, green transport, net zero enabling technologies, and the incorporation of climate readiness into credit risk assessments. The Data and Standards Working Group is looking at the shared data infrastructure that will support these products that are created, as well as the wider ecosystem of climate and risk-related data requirements. And the Policy Working Group, which I lead, supports both product innovation and data and standards in collaborating with partners and external stakeholders to recommend approaches for policy implementation. So in terms of, we're again very open to collaboration with a very broad range of stakeholders, and whilst product innovation is very much focused on insurance, certainly from a policy perspective, we see many opportunities to create, reinforce messages across other stakeholders, across financial services and green finance sectors. So we're always welcoming new people to join. Back to you, Gavin.
Thanks, Jenna. So we've got a couple of minutes just to go through some questions. I want to come back to Nick to begin with, and say that we've got this huge potential. We've got University College Dublin creating macroeconomic analysis of how we might build back into more of a green economy. We've got the University of Edinburgh gathering data from hundreds of thousands of businesses on a weekly basis from their individual bank statements, for example. So we're getting more access to more data than we've had in the past. What do you think the potential here could be, and who do you most want to engage with?
Okay, well, yes, I think the potential is huge. I think this is one of the big questions of our time, which is how do we, I think when we look back at 2008, and that was a big financial crisis, and how can we make the system better? I think lots of people obviously felt disappointed by where that went. I think we have to get into a place where, how do we use this completely effectively to get to the net zero targets that we want? We don't allow any of that to slide. In fact, we use it as an impetus to improve those things. In terms of reaching people, I want to obviously influence everywhere we can. I want to influence the government as much as we can, this government, the next government. I want to have something that's, robust enough in terms of its policy recommendations to be, not immediate, but not entirely time limited, if that makes sense. So something that you can pick up. You'd ideally pick up now, but you could also pick it up in a couple of years if that was where we were. And particularly given we don't know how long the COVID crisis is going to last from here. So those are all the things that I'm sort of bearing in mind. So I'd like to reach a Westminster audience, but also a wider audience in the country, an academic audience, a business audience. I think what I want to do with the output is to make it as accessible as possible to all those groups.
Great, thank you. And Miles, we're just in the process now of spinning up advisory groups to help us navigate through what's going to be a very short sprint on open energy. What's your number one ask for participants at the moment?
So really lean in and really help shape this whole program. We have already started understanding what sector user needs look like, and we did a lot of work in phase one. Now translating that into actually how do we make this work, so the big policy questions. So for example, to do this we need to address issues like what does it take for a service provider to play in this kind of ecosystem? That's an unknown. We need to work through that. We also need to be thinking about what's the shape of the preemptive licensing framework look like. We need to think about all of the operational aspects of this, particularly aspects like security, testing, data privacy, those kind of areas. And also we need to make sure that as we develop the technical aspects of it, that we're not missing any tricks on ensuring that what we build is as good as it can possibly be, given the fantastic start we've already got. So I'm asking for imagination, creativity, commitment, going the extra mile. That will get us the result that that we're really looking for here, Gavin.
Great. And Jana, similar question. We're some way into the project now, but we're still at the beginning of the journey overall. What's your one ask for the potential audience here?
My one ask, that's quite constraining, Gavin, unlike you. I think many of the concepts that we've been looking at in terms of enabling climate-ready outcomes are very well understood on the capital market side of things, and are concepts that are increasingly being built into business models. Insurance, on the other hand, has been very much focused on the physical risks associated with climate change. And what's really unique about what we're doing at SERI is that we're looking at insurance as a potential enabler of net zero and climate ready outcomes. But we do recognize as well that insurance is just one part of the puzzle. There are many blockers to, for example, the adoption of technologies that can that are themselves net zero enabling, and what we need is a collaborative ecosystem of participants from many different backgrounds. So whether it's in the financial services space, those who are looking at the financing of these types of companies and initiatives, whether it's those companies themselves who can tell us what their blockers to commercialization and adoption are. And also organizations who are looking at how to promote the adoption of climate-ready technologies and innovations and promotion of climate-ready behaviors. So it's quite a broad cross-section that we're looking for, really. Anyone who's aligned with our messages and willing to collaborate.
Super, thanks very much. Well, look, thanks for watching, everyone. We're really keen to engage, as you can tell, from across the city and regional level with Project Cygnus, looking at how we can stimulate economic activity that drives both the economy and our net zero targets, with open energy, on engaging across the entire sector to unlock value and, again, drive us to net zero. And finally, with SERI, with the financial products such as insurance, how can we use that lever to create the change that we all need to see? Please sign up or join us at the URL that's on your website, on your screen at the moment. Thank you.
Right. Welcome. Thanks for that, Gavin. That was amazing. That's Icebreaker 1. What I love about this project, it actually exists and it's doing things and they have an ambition. And we are not just talking about what could happen or what would happen or can we think about all of the blockers to doing things. We're actually getting on and doing things. So that's amazing. I've got a couple of questions for Gavin. I think that talk may have blown people's minds a bit because we haven't got that many questions coming through on the chat. But if you were going to tell us what timescale Icebreaker 1 would make a difference, that's my question to you, is when will we see things happening and when will we make a difference?
That's a great question. Thanks, Paul. And I've got Jana here with me as well to help answer any questions that might arise. So our driver here is that climate change isn't going to wait around, so we need to act quickly. Our kind of motto here of the time for theory is over. We need to get on and act is really prescient. We set up with the SERI program to take to market and test a climate ready financial product by November this year. Originally it was the COP, but the COP's moved. So, but we've stuck with the date. So that's next month. With Open Energy, we're going to have this up and running in alpha form also by November, so next month. And with Project Cygnus, that is a European funded project, and partly because of Brexit as well, that has to be delivered this year, so by the end of December. So all of these projects are going to have some material outputs this year in 2020 and lay foundations for 2021. We've set a target for the organization to be influencing through the use of data, through the use of open standards, through the use of and development of climate-ready financial products. We want to be influencing $3.6 trillion per annum by 2030. So there isn't very much time to develop and test what works. And the reason we've picked that number is roughly how much we spend globally on infrastructure per annum. And it all needs to be net zero, and it needs to be demonstrably net zero. So, and again, the reason for that is all of the infrastructure we build over the next decade will be baked in for the next, for the decades after that. If you look at something like HS2, that's got a lifespan of 100, 150 years. So all of the infrastructure we build over the next 10 years is going to define what carbon footprint we're going to have by 2050.
Fantastic. So the answer to my question is now. We're seeing things happening now, which is amazing. And one of our mottos here, and we've nicked it from Ben Goldacre, is that one of the things he's most happy about his Open Safely work and the Icebreaker 1 work and some of our works is it actually exists, and it's not a bunch of tech people talking about it. It's actual the stuff that makes a difference. So
that's a really good point. If I actually build on that, we're obsessively driven by user needs. So the reason for picking or setting targets to design and test products in the market is to get away from that sort of rhetoric of what if, or maybe we could create the framework for X or Y. We really are very keen to connect directly with the end decision makers here, the CFOs or the asset managers or the financial decision makers and policy makers who are wrestling with these questions themselves. You know, we're here to help provide a huge amount of support there. And in the last 6 months, we've grown our team between ourselves and our partners and our advisory groups and so on to over 100 people. So there's a big corpus of domain knowledge here that we're bringing to bear. And we're very keen for people to join in this conversation and say, well, what can we really take out and test and see what works now?
Fantastic. So my last point is, if someone wanted to join in and help, how would they do it?
Super. Well, on the website, icebreaker1.org/join, you'll see there's ways to sign up, and there are email addresses. Michelle Brook is our community manager. So just email us directly and get involved, and we can route you from there.
Fantastic. And I'd just like to say we're working with Icebreaker 1 on their Project Cygnus work. We've got quite a tight timescale where we're trying to help Icebreaker 1 on Project Cygnus understand what data exists, what data needs to exist, and what we've already worked on to help underpin with some data infrastructure the work that Icebreaker 1 are doing. So again, if you want to get in touch with us or Icebreaker 1, please do that. And everything is going to be as open as possible. So radically open, so you can join in at your pace and when you're ready, not at our pace. But we will be chivying people along on that to help out. So thanks very much to Gavin and Miles and the rest of the Icebreaker 1 team. It's fantastic work. And we'll be putting the talk online, and you'll be seeing more of that in the future. So the next two talks we've got are linked to this. We've got Warren Goodall from Slow the Flow, which is all about doing work in this part of the world to deal with the impact of flooding, the impact of grouse moors, and how we can actually do things that make a difference to people's lives in and around Yorkshire, especially in and around Hebden Bridge, where they were impacted significantly. Warren can't join us for a Q&A, so we're going to go straight into Mary Black from Northern Power Grid, who are a sponsor of ODI Leads, but also they have to build a model of the electricity network for, as Gavin says, for 10s, 20s, hundreds of years in the future, about that, how that infrastructure is going to manage in the future. We've been helping them publish their data, build models, and stop writing reports about it, and then share back the information they've got. So we're really excited and pleased that Northern Power Grid are going to talk about their work and how they're going to hopefully have a model that they can share back to everyone else who's working on Icebreaker 1 in the future. So that's going to be straight after Warren Goodall from Slow the Flow. We're going to have Mary Black. And then we've got, I think we've got Simon and Mary who's going to join us for the Q&A after that. So without messing about anymore, we're going to listen to Warren and Slow the Flow. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Warren Goodall and I'm a trustee of Slow the Flow based in Calderdale, West Yorkshire. We are a charity aimed at increasing the use of natural flood management techniques through education and awareness raising. And I want to take you through some of the issues that we have, as a volunteer organisation, have encountered in the first meeting that we put together in 2016. The project live from Boxing Day 2015, when the Calder Valley suffered one of the most significant flooding events in recent times. Just under 3,000 homes and 4,500 businesses were flooded along the Calder Valley on Boxing Day 2015. From that event, a group of local people came together to try and make a difference using natural flood management techniques to prevent similar rainfall events causing such devastation in the future. Slow the Flow came together at that point. A group of volunteers said we developed a pilot project which gained initial support from DEFRA and then further funding from the Environment Agency and others. And then we began implementation in 2015. And the project, as the maps show, is on land above Hebden Bridge in the Calder Valley, which was significantly impacted, owned by the National Trust in a place called Hardcastle Crags. The National Trust have since become in the delivery of the project. We also got local support from Calderdale Council, Hebden Royd Town Council, the Community Foundation for Calderdale, and the Rotary Club of Hebden Bridge. So as far as the data is concerned, which is what we're talking about today, the monitoring strategy that we put together was initially our own devising, but we funding from DEFRA and the EA. There are criteria that they like to see in place. So we followed that monitoring guidance to further develop the monitoring program. And we used some of the devices you see on the screen there, ultrasonic bridge monitors to gauge river levels. We did in-stream pressure inducers and in-stream V-notch weirs on the bottom left, and allied with time-lapse cameras and fixed point photography to find out what was going on before the interventions that we put in place, the natural flood management techniques, and those without. So the experience that we kind of had through the project is we were dealing with large organizations with governance protocols and procedures in place. So the decision making from funders was slow, which causes some issues for us as a small voluntary organisation, in that we missed a whole season of construction work, which meant we were liable to more flooding in the following winter. Luckily enough, that didn't happen. As the project developed, we also had different criteria asked of us to do the monitoring as the best practice, I guess, developed, because this is all new areas in a technique of flood management. So this created some issues for us also. Some of the monitoring equipment itself proved problematic. The bridge monitors work remotely, and so have areas where the signal is very poor, which causes a lot of drain on battery. So half the time, so we've got bits of data missing. Some of the monitoring locations didn't come online as planned, as the interventions were delayed. We're not letting. We were reliant on some partners to help us deliver some of this, and that caused further delays in just talking to each other and saying who's going to do what. Some of the data sets are relatively large, and we are a volunteer organisation with poor resource, really. So we didn't have the software or probably the data manipulation skills to get the best out of the data that we'd hoped to. And I suppose in summary, as we were working on the hoof with this, with things changing around us, the monitoring strategy that we put in place could have been more robust from the outset. And also we could have got more support partners in manipulating the data on an ongoing basis, which we're still collecting. But it worked. The central graph that you see in front of you is a blue series and a red series. The blue series is taken from the top of a stream, and the red series is at the bottom of a stream with natural flood management interventions in between the two. See that there's a difference in height of the water, but there are some kind of local issues around that. So that's 100% accurate. But what is accurate is you see the first peak, which I'll just use my hand for. The first peak here at the top of the stream, and the first peak at the bottom of the stream here are 45 minutes. So it's slowed, which is what we wanted it to do. The second peak here, peaks rather, and here are an hour and a quarter apart. So that shows have worked, but we could have got more evidence from more locations in a more robust way, with potentially the data providing additional information that we've been unable to do so far. So we've learned quite a lot. We have also included habitat monitoring in the program, but it didn't seem to fit very well. Fundamentally, we are a team of volunteers working with governmental agencies, national bodies, local government, with paid officers in place. So we felt some additional support from that would have helped us a great deal. Thank you very much.
Right, so welcome to Mary and Simon from Northern Power Grid, who are going to talk a little bit about the DFES work that we conducted with them last year. So I'm just going to start by asking you, Mary, so remind us what happened during the last year.
Okay, well, it was this time a year ago, we had developed what are called distribution future energy scenarios. We call it DFES for short, which are different pathways to meet a low carbon future. And we teamed up with Planet Data a year ago in September and asked if you could, ODI leads, could put all our data onto a visual map so that people in different local authorities and different industries could zoom into their areas and see our projections for electric vehicles and heat pumps. It was a very exciting project. It was the first time that open data had really been used to begin a conversation about energy and what the future of energy should look like. So some people will have seen this already, but shall I very quickly just share my screen to give people a recap of what we developed and what ODI leads developed for us? Right, we developed these scenarios. This is clearly a map of the northeast in Yorkshire, which is the region that Northern Power Grid distributes electricity to. And we had a number of scenarios. We take scenarios that National Grid develop and we model them and interpret them across our region. And you could look at different pathways to a low carbon future, community renewables being a mainly electric heat pump, electric heat and transport pathway with electric vehicles and heat pumps. 2 degrees was a more hydrogen economy based pathway. So you could choose your scenario and you could zoom into a region. And I always choose Wakefield just because that's where I live. And you can see how many electric vehicles we think we've got today in 2020. And then I could zoom forward, say to 2030, and you could click on Wakefield again, see how many, 61,000, and that says the pathway. If you want to have a low carbon future, you're going to need 61,000 electric vehicles in Wakefield. And you could then drill down and look at the different substations, electricity substations that supply electricity across Wakefield, and see how many electric vehicles were associated with each of them. And it wasn't just electric vehicles you could do it for, it was heat pumps, it was solar generation, it was wind generation, it was our peak demand, it was all sorts of electrical parameters. And the whole point of this tour was to start a conversation, and that's what we did. We had a whole series of events and workshops. We showed this tour to people and we asked people to provide us feedback. We published it as open data and we published some feedback forms, and we asked people if they could come back to us and tell us what they thought are of the pathways and what their own plans were for maybe electric bus schemes and hydrogen hubs and any other kinds of developments that were going to affect the energy of the future. So we started this conversation this time a year ago with DFES 2019. So I'll stop sharing my screen there and let you carry on with your next question.
So I'm interested in what feedback you had when you showed this to people.
Okay, well, I'll take the lead on that to start with, and to say, yeah, you'll see from the map that Mary shared, there's a wide range of local authorities across the whole of the Northern Power Grid patch, from very industrial cities right the way to very rural communities. And we wanted to get the information out there, that this is information to share for people to engage with and to look to see what low carbon futures might look like. And I think it's fair to say we had a good level of interest on this, and actually there's quite a few local authorities recognise that there's the net zero targets for 2050, but they themselves are wanting to engage with this to look at what it means by going for net zero even earlier than that to 2035 and perhaps even sooner as well. So it's fair to say I've had a good level of engagement on that. I think Mary's also got some interesting industry feedback that she'd like to share with us as well.
Yes, we kind of expected many local authorities to get back to us, and we had some very interesting feedback from the glass industry saying, well, hang on, what about industry? The forecast seems to be for declining electricity consumption, but how do you think we're going to meet low carbon targets if we don't turn our glass furnaces from gas furnaces into electric furnaces? And that set us on a whole pathway where we started exploring industry, because it's so important to our region, where you've got big amounts of space heating, which needs to be fuel switched, is the term that they use. We have the steel industry, we have a whole number of industries that are quite carbon intensive in our region, and they want to be part of this journey as well. So that was a bit of feedback we passed on to National Grid, and that's actually made its way into the national scenarios this year.
That's great. So what else have you done? What other things have you done with that feed within Northern Power Grid, perhaps?
Okay, well, picking up from what Simon said about people's ambitions to reach net zero, the National Grid scenarios last year didn't reach net zero. They only reached an 80% target reduction in the target. So I'm going to share my screen again and show you some emerging thinking scenarios that we developed that began to look at what net zero might look like. So if I go into our emerging thinking scenarios, you can see that we looked at the pathways and we thought, well, the hydrogen pathway is definitely one. And because we're going to be using national grid scenarios in the future, we wanted to make sure we could be compatible with that as well. So we've got a high hydrogen scenario. We've got a deep electrification scenario, which again is the electric heat route. Both of these scenarios have electric transport. The high hydrogen probably has more hydrogen in the heavy goods vehicles, the big lorries and so on. And then we also developed an early net zero scenario, which reached net zero in 2045. And the point of this was because people have got an ambition to get to net zero earlier, it was to show them what the pathway looked like. These scenarios, the parameters and so on were exactly the same. So you could compare them to DFES 2019. You could zoom in again. It's exactly the same tool. We've got lots more information. If you scroll right down to the bottom, we've got lots of interesting information about what's gone into these scenarios and how we've developed them. And so the whole point of that was to use the feedback we've been given, look at how the pathways might be a bit more ambitious, feed that information back to National Grid. And because we developed this in a bottom-up tool, we're now going to be able, when we move on to DFES 2020, to take local feedback about industry or particular, there might be some hydrogen hubs over here on the East Coast. We'll be able to layer that information into our bottom-up tool as well. So that's what we did with the feedback we were given this time. I think it was right up to the first lockdown. We were getting feedback, and obviously COVID did get in the way a little bit and slow down what feedback we had, but we managed to do what we could with what people had told us at all the events we were running.
Yeah, and I'll pick up from that, that what this is doing, all this data is great data, and it's helping us to look at what does our network need to do to match these aspirations. So at the moment, we're going through what's called our business planning for the next regulatory review period, where we're looking at, with the projected load growth, what does that mean? Have we got sufficient capacity in our network? Do we need to reinforce anywhere? Can we think of better ways of getting more out of our network? So all that information that we're getting there, it's actually informing our business plan at the moment. Clearly, when we get the next DFES done and more information coming from there, that's going to help us fine tune that information. And as we get more engagement with local authorities, with stakeholder groups, as that information comes in, that's also going to help play into how we look to future plan our network.
Great stuff. So you both mentioned the next DFES 2020. Can you tell me a bit about the plans around that?
Yes, I'll come in on that, and I'll also talk about some of our other next steps at MPG. So DFES 2020 will be launched in December, and that's going to take National Grid's scenarios which were published in July and which do now meet net zero. We're in the middle of modelling that with the help of Element Energy across our region. As I speak, that modelling work's being done. And then we're also putting a scenario that brings in some of the best experience that we've had from local feedback, so that we're bringing that feedback right onto the page for people to look at. So that's one of the things we're doing. But I think along with that, Simon mentioned better ways compared to reinforcement of managing our network. One of the big buzzwords is flexibility. And we think open data has got a big role to play in us understanding if we want flexibility is where customers start smart charging their vehicles. So rather than charging it when they get home at night at the peak hour, they're prepared to charge at a different time so that we can help spread the load and reduce the peaks in the network. But in order to be able to manage lots and lots of electric vehicles, we need lots and lots of data, and we need it in a way that's distributed and it's decentralized. It's a new way of looking at data compared to the old sort of central databases and optimization routines of the past. And this is where open data can play such a role. So we've been part of developing a common language with other distribution network operators and National Grid, where we can look at what we call the building blocks that go into the future energy pathways, which are things like the number of electric vehicles, the number of heat pumps. And we're beginning to try and share these building blocks with other stakeholders in the region, with local authorities, with industry, so we can all start beginning to speak a common language, which is going to make it much easier to share our data and interface our data together.
Great. So what are the next steps in terms of stakeholder engagement?
Okay, I'll pick up on that one. And yeah, so the DFES 2020, when we publish that, it's going to be going out in December time, and we're going to be launching an engagement event in January of 2021, doing this as a group event where we want people to come along to that, all interested parties, local authorities, industry groups, etc. And we're very keen to get as much engagement as possible on that. And we really want to then have a follow on from that with lots of engagements face to face with a lot of the interested parties. So it's watch this space for that, but I'm very keen for people to contact me to then be able to get put in touch for this.
Well, that's brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Really good and informative stuff. And thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
So we've got Simon Jesser and Mary Black from Northern Power Grid who are going to answer some questions. We've got some great ones in the chat. I've got some questions as well, as always, so we'll share them. So we've got two questions from Sheridan Few. And the first question is basically, how did you take the data from National Grid and disaggregate it down to regions and smaller geographies and make it applicable to different parts of the country and different parts of the region you operate in?
I think I'd better come and stand in while Mary's logging herself back in. She must have had some comms problems. Yeah, we've worked very closely with Element Energy, and so what we've done is we've taken the future energy scenarios as described, as National Grid have done, and then Element Energy have worked with those to actually work with lots of local data, so looking at things like vehicle registrations in areas and things like that, and looking to look at the shape of the area, whether it's rural, whether it's urban, looking at what the kind of take-up rates will be for electric vehicles, for heat pumps, and to try and form a local flavour of the actual take-ups of low carbon technologies. So the National Grid data is very much at a macro, high-level scenario, looking top downwards, whereas what we're trying to do is do the bottom upwards, to take that local view, where we can take views from local industry about what some of their future plans are. Then we're looking to try and take that on board as well. And then, for example, some of the local authorities, if they are looking to say that they want climate emergencies, net zero early, we're trying to take that and factor that in. But absolutely, the key thing is that we're wanting to provide information in the first place for people to then engage with it and then say, right, what does a low carbon future look like to me? So the visualization tool there is very much something that it takes the data from Element Energy, feeds that out. So Element Energy has started with the future energy scenarios, applied that as a local level for distribution future energy scenarios, and then shaping that outwards through this great ODI tool that will then allow people to then engage with it, looking at each of the different scenarios, saying, right, in 2035, what does that mean for Sheffield, say? You know, is that 100,000 electric vehicles in Sheffield region by 2035? So it's very much that bottom-up approach that's informed it. So it's a great question, thanks, Sheridan.
Fantastic. And just on that, I'd like to ask Mary how the change from how you used to do this to putting the publishing the data and then putting the tool on the web, how has that changed the way in which data is viewed within Northern Power Grid and how you see that's going to change in the future?
I think traditionally data has been kept secret by big organizations, and people have been maybe defensive and a little bit shy about showing their data because it it begs questions, it subjects you to scrutiny, you might be giving away information that other people can take commercial advantage of, and so on. We're maybe not so worried about that in a distribution network because we've always recognised we've had to share data with other organisations to help run electricity networks safely. So we've got quite a good tradition of data sharing within the industry. What we haven't done is put it in the public domain, not least because we want people to be careful how they use the data. So we had to overcome some sort of psychological barriers, I think, sharing the data, to not be scared of exposing people to the reality of data that has errors in it, because there's no such thing as perfect data. And when you have open data, people can actually help you improve your data by feeding back to you what those problems are. So if you can develop a non-defensive type of psychology in your head, if you like, then you can accept that data, but people give back to you and not feel defensive about it. But it's got to be done because historically we've had big centralized databases, big networks being run using optimization techniques, but you can't do that with the sheer number of technologies we're talking about. If you've got an electric vehicle you're meant to be managing at nearly every household, a heat pump in nearly every house, how can you begin to manage the future if you're relying on a huge centralized databases and those kind of old techniques? You can't do it anymore.
Yeah, well, I think that's we describe it as the sort of the blue pill and the red pill in the matrix. And once an organization has taken it, says, well, why weren't we doing this before? And we've been doing this with a year for you now, and the sky hasn't fallen in, no one's died, and in fact you've got a much better product than you had previously, and it's fantastic. And that leads us on to Sheridan's second question, which is what are other DNOs doing with this? And as of this month, we can share that we're actually working with UK Power Networks for the South East to do the same thing. And what's brilliant is that UK Power Networks can benefit from the code and the approaches we've developed in the open. They're going to improve on some of this, which we will then share back with UK Power Networks when we do their next DFES in the future. So this is it really is a virtuous circle where the methods and approaches start to coalesce. People work on things that are appropriate for their region that are not appropriate for others, but then they share them in the future, and it allows people to join in when they're ready, not on a timescale that's set by someone else. And it takes a lot of the risk and also the tension out of how people are operating. So the second question about other DNOs is that we actually are working with UK Power Networks in the Southeast. We are talking to one and maybe two other DNOs about their models. And then the dream for us is that we don't own the model. We don't want to be DFES production people. We help the DNOs prepare their data in a useful way. We can help them with visualizations. But then when other people have other data, so if local authorities or investment or people, Total have bought a whole load of charging network in London. When other people know about other data that they can then share, the model that the DNOs have put together about what's going to happen in the future then becomes our model, not just their model. So it becomes an asset that we can use. And we're already thinking about how this asset could be used in our work with Icebreaker 1 and their project Cygnus. And we've not even talked to Mary about it. We've not asked their permission, but we know that using that data in that context will help, but also that Northern Power Grid will probably most likely get some better data back as well. So it's a real virtuous circle. And the whole thing for me is that people don't have to ask permission to use the assets and resources that we've all generated, but we all can benefit from it. So yeah, that's thanks so much to the Northern Power Grid team there. I'm just going to check to see if there's any more questions. and it looks like you got away with it. So we had two really great questions. And just to let people know, we'll be working with Northern Power Grid on the next DFES. And if you want to get involved, if you're working for the local authority and you have data about that, that'll be amazing. So thanks to Mary and thanks to Simon. Thanks very much for that. Next up, we've got Doug Johnston from EY. EY helps us with Planet Data 2. And Doug's going to talk to us about the role of the positive effect of investors and how they can have to help people influence, meet and exceed their sustainability targets. So I'll hand over to Doug. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name's Doug Johnston. I work for Ernst & Young, and I lead our climate change and sustainability practice. What I wanted to share with you today is the role of the investor in driving the climate agenda for major corporates. We've all seen major corporates really go out there and set increasingly stringent targets themselves as they strive towards net zero. But what has the role of the investor been in actually making that happen? And that's what I'd like to explore now. So I've got a few slides, so bear with me, and hopefully this can guide the discussion that we're going to have. So we've seen the headlines, haven't we, of investors stepping out and saying how important they see climate change in an understanding of an organization's performance. Increasingly, what we're seeing is that organizations are demanding the disclosure of their climate performance. Some investors are asking large corporates to commit to increasingly stringent targets. And what we've got here are a few headlines of companies that have responded. So we've got Nestle, we've got Royal Dutch Shell, we've got power generation. So it's not just investors placing pressure on the oil and gas companies. Actually, they're starting to engage with a whole range of sectors in terms of the role that climate change plays in the performance of those businesses. Now, it's not that the investors necessarily are being altruistic. They recognize the very close link between financial performance and the way in which organizations respond to climate change. They're recognizing that some organizations' markets are going to be significantly disrupted by climate change, or increasing regulation is going to increase the cost base on companies, or that the physical changes of climate change are going to disrupt an organization's supply chains, or their ability to maintain and operate infrastructure. So they're not doing it for altruistic reasons. They're doing it primarily because they recognize this link between an organization's response to climate change and the future viability of the business. So at EY, we do lots of surveys, as you'd probably expect. And about 3 months ago, we completed a survey of over 300 institutional investors. And the purpose of the survey was to understand how investors were really starting to engage companies on their non-financial performance and what they were looking for from companies in terms of that performance. And what I've got here are some of the statistics that I've drawn out from that. And this is the key question that this is responding to. So we asked the question, in the past 12 months, how frequently has a company's non-financial performance played a pivotal role in your investment decision-making? And you can see the statistics for yourself. 91% of companies over the course of the last 12 months considered non-financial information as being pivotal in the investment decisions that they've made. And 43% of them said that that was frequently, so over many of the decisions that they'd made, and 48% saying occasionally. So this is massive. I mean, what does this actually mean? It means that the investment decisions that are made of some of the largest companies in the world, and those decisions that underpin our investment, our pension pots, are based on decisions that link to the non-financial performance, and increasingly not just the non-financial performance, but the performance of a company in relation to climate change. Now, what about the information that organizations share on their performance in relation to climate change? Many of you will be aware of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So increasingly, organizations are being asked to demonstrate the link between climate change and their long-term financial prospects. And the task force makes a series of recommendations for how organizations start to disclose that information to investors, such that investors can make informed decisions on it. Now, again, we do lots of surveys, and we looked at 900 of the world's largest organizations and how they're disclosing climate risk. And we looked at their compliance with the recommendations of the task force. And what we've seen is that actually, whilst there is progress in climate-related disclosure, i.e. the information that investors can use to make decisions, it's not of the best quality. So whilst there's 54% coverage of the recommendations, only 27% of the information meets the quality thresholds that we would expect. I mean, let me just give you an example of that. So you've got a lot of organizations that are starting to say, our material climate risks relate to a change in weather patterns, which disrupts our supply chains. It relates to increasing regulation that might place an additional cost associated with the carbon emissions that we release. What's missing from a lot of these disclosures are the numbers. So how much of an impact is that? How will you be disrupted? Under what circumstance will you be disrupted? And what difference will that make in terms of your ability to achieve your strategy? So what's really missing is this tangible link between climate-related information and information relating to the financial performance of the company. So in the absence of this information, what are organizations doing? So organizations that certainly we're working with are increasingly looking at sophisticated ways in which they can understand the impact of a changing climate on their business. Many of you will be aware of the scenario modeling that companies are doing, looking at a 2-degree or a 4-degree scenario and looking at how the projected changes in temperature or sea level or weather patterns might affect their infrastructure and how they can provide for that, or how it might affect the sourcing regions that they have. So data has a massive role to play in terms of giving investors what they want, but also potentially modeling the market. You know, how is demand for your product going to be affected by changing attitudes towards climate change? How quick will the switch be to electrification, and what impact might that have on your company? Or the switch from liquid fuels to electric vehicles. I mean, what impact is that going to have on your business, and how do you model that? So increasingly, companies are looking at much more sophisticated models to look at this link between climate and financial performance. What I wanted to share is an investor initiative called Climate Action 100. Now, we've been working with Climate Action 100 over the last 3 months, and they've recently released a new benchmark framework, which provides a structured way in which investors can look into the full spectrum of the programs that underpin the climate goals of an organization. Now, what this stems from is you've got lots of organizations that are now coming out with, you know, we believe that to protect shareholder value, we need to commit to a very stringent carbon reduction target. And what investors are increasingly doing is asking the questions of the company and demanding information which enables them to get beneath that. So let's say an organization sets a target for net zero. Well, do they have the CapEx plans in place to support that? Do they have the stakeholder relationships which will enable that? Do they have the right governance infrastructure that can enable them to monitor progress against that? Do they have the right senior leaders that are accountable for it? So what Climate Action 100 are doing is they've established a framework which enables investors to ask those questions and to analyze that information and then to benchmark companies from a climate risk perspective. They've also become quite a lobbying group, and you'll have seen from the headlines that I shared earlier that Climate Action have been really active in driving change across some major corporates, in encouraging them to set targets which set their course towards the Paris Agreement. I'm nearly coming into land here, but some of the things that I just wanted to share with you is that if you're a major corporate and you're looking at your climate strategy, your investors will have a view as to how climate affects your business. It's really important that you're able to understand that story for yourselves and set targets that enable you to appropriately manage the risks and opportunities in your business that enables you to get to where you need to get to in terms of supporting the world to get to the Paris Agreement. Investors are becoming increasingly sophisticated in the way in which they're engaging companies. And what we're seeing is that investors are using this information not just to influence change, but it is starting to influence the investment decisions that they make. And investors themselves are now setting commitments towards net zero. So I'm going to stop there. Do email me at EY if you have any questions. But I'm very pleased that I was able to meet with you today. And thank you very much. Hopefully that's been helpful. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks very much, Doug. That was a fascinating talk and amazing. And I think it really shows the way in which the climate emergency has been addressed by investors and industry, despite what's going on in politics.
Absolutely.
I've got a couple of questions. You've got away with it in the chat. But
oh, good. Well, come on, everybody. Let's have a bit of chat coming through.
Yeah, that would be great. But if you were going to forecast the future, when do you think the oil and gas companies are going to be net zero and not digging things up anymore for us to burn?
Yeah. So the answer to that question depends upon actually what that question means.
Okay.
Because net zero is an ambition which is recognized that there will continue to be emissions, but there will also be activities that are negative and actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. So in terms of net zero, in the context of an oil and gas company, what does that mean? So you've seen lots of oil and gas companies that have set targets to have net zero in their operations. So that means, you know, the 70 million tons or so of an oil and gas's carbon footprint will become zero through deploying efficiency savings and carbon capture, utilization and storage. The really tricky bit for an oil and gas company is their product mix. So a hydrocarbon product and using it clearly emits carbon. And so the more challenging bit is the net zero ambition relating to the products. And very few oil and gas companies have actually committed to that aspect of it. So when will a company be net zero? Well, some companies have said that in their operations, they're going to be net zero by 2030. Some have said 2040. But in terms of net zero across the full value chain, I think we've got some time to wait.
Okay. We've just got, okay, right, the questions are piling in now.
Oh, brilliant.
So, and this is one close to our heart. So, companies publishing their data, do you think that greenhouse gas carbon emissions data will be published by companies in machine readable format, much as the way they submit their returns to Companies House?
You would imagine so, and it already is, isn't it? So a lot of the investors are using machines to analyze climate-related data at scale that's been published, and there's already the technology out there to suck the information from the reports of companies and to analyze it at scale. So it's already happening. I think the bigger issue is actually, is carbon emissions data the right data? Because the amount of carbon an organization emits is just one data point. Because actually the climate agenda is much bigger than that. You know, it's also about how that organization is going to be affected by a changing climate and how it is protecting, you know, the viability of that business by responding effectively to it. But I think, you know, just a general point is I think more accessible information is definitely a really important part of stakeholders being able to judge the progress that companies are making in this regard. And I think investors are starting to be increasingly sophisticated in the way in which they get at that information and form conclusions about progress. So I think to answer that question very directly, I think we're already there.
Okay, well, maybe afterwards we'll get in touch and try and, as part of the write-up for this, is try and put some links to where that data might live and how that might be accessed and used and shared.
Yep.
For us to look at. So we'd love to catch up with you on that and make that happen. We're part of the, you might have heard as the Project Cygnus work with Icebreaker 1 is for us to try and create a catalogue of economic data to build back better for a post-COVID economy in the UK and Ireland. And so maybe we'll create a separate piece around emissions data, carbon data that we can put in that, especially in the corporate reporting piece.
No, I think that's great. I think that's great. And just linked to that, there's a really important new narrative that's emerging around the climate debate around just transition, which you're probably very familiar with, which is all about what does it actually mean in terms of jobs and prosperity for communities.
Because actually, because it turns the conversation from a esoteric data point around carbon emissions, which I've got 2 degrees in environmental science, so I understand it. But people they can't conceive that. So
no, exactly.
So how can we present that data in a meaningful way? And a couple of questions in here is that one around which sectors lead the way in climate-related disclosures, and also, do you think are people starting to look at plastic pollution? So plastic pollution registers as well as carbon emissions registers.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I in terms of so why don't I start with the last question, because
the sectors,
so in terms of sectors leading the way, I mean, in terms of transparency, definitely the biggest polluters, I think, are the ones that have led the way in terms of transparency. So I mean, if we do a lot of benchmarking around climate-related financial disclosures, and by far the most comprehensive disclosures are coming from the energy sector, closely followed, interestingly, by the finance sector, financial services. So increasingly, the stakeholders of financial services companies are asking them, well, how is your financing and the viability of your financing going to be affected by all the money that you're giving to these companies that might not be viable as a result of climate change? Prove it to us that you have strategies that's going to maintain resilience in your loan book, for example. But then sectors like automotive are really starting to gather pace now. So it's really those sectors where the climate agenda is critical to defining whether they're successful or not. I think that's where disclosure has been strongest. So it's automotive, it's agriculture, it's energy, but energy is definitely leading the way. To the last point around plastics, sorry, the question was more availability of plastics information and what we're seeing there. I think there's much less information around what organizations are doing in relation to plastic. And I think in a similar way to carbon, actually, the way in which an organization responds in terms of its strategy to the use of plastics in packaging and its products could potentially define its future success. So the interesting thing is I'm seeing investors are starting to engage in a much more strategic way around plastics, because, you know, if you can't transform your business in the way in which you use plastics, you may not have a business, particularly if your customers are changing their preferences, regulation is changing at pace. So it's quite interesting that actually I'm seeing sort of plastic, it's not going to get to quite the same level of maturity as carbon, but it's certainly getting up there. There's a lot more rigor going into sort of accuracy of numbers around that, so that stakeholders can make more informed decisions.
Fantastic. So that's the end of the questions.
Thank you,
I'm really
Paul.
happy that the looks like we're running smack on time for the Planet Data Conference. It's the new way of doing things, isn't it?
It is. It's brilliant. Well done.
We'd love you to stay in touch with us around our our work, so I got distracted there by a question, but yeah, that's fine. We'd love you to stay involved around our way of trying to catalogue useful data, make it available for people. So we'd love you to join in with that, and we'll help.
Sure, delighted to discuss that with you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
You'll join us. Next up, we've got two talks rolled into one. So we've got Chris Poynton from Cambridgeshire Climate Emergency, and we've got Stefan Hasselschwimmer from UK Carbon Map. So obviously we're moving on to a very relevant subject. And they're going to talk about how their recent work around mapping carbon locally has made a difference. So thanks, Doug. And we're going to listen to Chris and Stefan.
It's really important that we all take individual and collective responsibility for climate change and our carbon footprint. And the first thing you need to do is to know what your carbon footprint is and where the bad bits are. So the carbon map is about putting our finger onto exactly that. Where are the hotspots of carbon?
Tackling climate change requires coordinated action. It is vital that we all work together, collaborate effectively if we are to drastically reduce emissions. The Cambridge Carbon Map is a great way to do that.
Carbon dioxide is invisible, literally, in the atmosphere, but also figuratively in the daily decisions of ordinary people going about their lives. And that makes it difficult to manage. The Cambridge Carbon Map will help us measure how and where we emit carbon, as well as who we need to bring together to reduce it. And once we can measure it, we can manage it.
So it's basically this online platform where you can see the emissions data of various organizations. And we think that by bringing all this data together in one place, from out of the shadows or wherever it was hidden, makes it much more powerful, much more likely to instigate change.
The Cambridge Carbon Map aims to be a collaboration between all organisations in Cambridge, be it the university, the council or local businesses, and the idea is that we put everyone's carbon emission data onto an online map which is easily accessible.
So one of the main aims of the map that I really like is this sense of creating a community when it comes to climate action.
We've got not just people from across different universities in the UK, but also a worldwide team of professionals who really believe in the core sort of aims and values of the project.
I love the project management. I love the support and collaboration from everybody on the team.
I got involved with Carbon Map because coming from a natural sciences background, I wanted to have some more hands-on experience.
We have such a global team that I'm always learning some new things when we are discussing.
Carbon Map is a platform allowing communities to come together, collaborate, discuss, and even compete, all in the name of climate action. We've had to communicate and present ideas clearly and help one another in solving problems. It's been a great journey so far, and I'm excited for what the future holds.
Now what we need is data from the organisations and businesses in Cambridge so that we can start to fill up the map and get the conversation going. We're also keen to hear from any organisations that would like to collaborate with us to extend the map, bring in more data or make it a more effective resource. We're very grateful to Cambridgeshire County Council, the City Council and also the University of Cambridge for all their support with this project. I'd also like to thank all of the volunteers who've been working on the carbon map for the last few months. They've done a fantastic job.
Good morning, my name is Stefan Hasselschwimmer and I'm one of the founders of the Cambridge Carbon Map. And today I'd like to talk about the UK Carbon Map. It's an idea basically to create a model that communities across the UK, whether they're villages, towns or cities, can adopt that represent some of the key values of the Cambridge Carbon Map. So what are those values? Well, firstly, it's all about collaboration. It's about bringing together lots of different diverse people to collect data so that we can be clear what we need to do on the climate challenge. Number two, It's about open and public data. It's about taking the data that already exists and making it freely available so that we can all be clear where we are with our carbon emissions. And the third and final thing, it's about taking carbon dioxide, this thing that's all around us, it's invisible, and trying to make it visible and tangible so that we can all be clear where we are and what we need to do about it. So those are the values. And we went away with the Carbon Map team and we tried to think about ways that we could create a model that could really take root in communities across the UK. And we came up with 3 broad ideas. Well, firstly, it's all about localism. It's about having local information. So the idea is to create local maps for every village, town and city across the UK. So whether that's cambridge.carbonmap.uk or brighton.carbonmap.uk or leeds.carbonmap.uk, it's about having local maps that show the local data. So we've got these maps. The risk is you start off with a map and it's like a big jigsaw and none of the pieces are filled in. So as a way of helping people get started, we thought, how can we start to fill in some of the pieces of the jigsaw? So we looked at the national data, and there is some quite good national data out there. There's data from universities, there's lots of data from large companies, and we started compiling that data together so to sort of provide, as it were, bits of the jigsaw already so that people can be less intimidated by the prospect of building this overall picture. And then the third element, which is really crucial, it's about empowerment. It's about making sure that each local community is empowered to collect the data and to build up its own local picture. So what we're proposing is what we're calling the Carbon Map Community Interest Company. So the idea is that every community would have its own Carbon Map KIC, Community Interest Company, and their job would be to collect the data, build partnerships among the local stakeholders, and to produce a final local map for each local community. And we're all about partnership and collaboration, so if anyone would like to work with us, please get in touch.
So, thanks Stefan, thanks Chris. That was an amazing talk and really inspiring. And I think there's a couple of questions in the chat where people are trying to build the Leeds carbon map. So I think for me, I've got a couple of questions and we're going to look at the chat here. So there's a question from Stuart Lower, ODI Leeds, sorry. Will the UK carbon map be available to download under an open license? And then we've got another question which Terry's asked, which says that question has arisen from the start, but there's no clear response. So Terry, could you actually say which question you want to address with that? And then from myself is what data would really help amplify and accelerate the work of the UK carbon map and your work in Cambridge? So there's 3 questions there. Will it be available under an open license? We need to find Terry and get him to ask his question. But also, what are the bits of the data infrastructure would really help you amplify your work?
So should I kick off on the UK carbon map? So at this stage, it's basically a kind of a vision. And I think we'd absolutely love it to be completely open source and downloadable so that everyone can sort of feed into the project. I think from our perspective, we're quite pragmatic. We need to find some funding to try and kind of underpin some of those developments to make sure that it's really solid code and so on. In terms of the data we'd like to see, I mean, it's company data is really important. So we'd love to again work with, for example, the previous speaker, maybe build a platform that we can be gathering that kind of company data. So that we can all be feeding, because I think if we all essentially can access a shared repository of data, that will benefit everybody. So yeah.
Great stuff. So Terry's question was about the UK carbon map being open. So I hopefully will be. I guess you're working on that. Good. And then specifically, how have you seen this benefit Cambridge, Chris? I guess that's one to you.
How it would benefit Cambridge, was that the question?
No, what benefits have we seen already from actually doing this work and moving things? And our positive thing is that this thing actually exists, which is amazing. And so how are you seeing this being applied in Cambridge, and how does it make a difference?
Well, it's early days at the moment. We've got buy-in from the local councils and from the university, and also from a local business group with about 5,000, mainly SMEs, to promote it. We were planning some sort of carbon footprint conversations with companies in the launch period, which is basically now. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to rewire those for a still remote world, but we're finding a lot of positive response to the concept. And the next thing, the coming months are about rolling it out and also being adaptive to what people want to know and how we can support them with that. So it's very early days. We're just starting to get this ball rolling, but it's very exciting to see what it's starting to trigger in terms of the conversations. And the core thing is to have those conversations. It's not just to capture the data. It's data to underline, to instigate action that we're trying to aim for.
Fantastic. So instigating action, that's definitely what we're all about here. And we're really pleased that you were involved in Planet Data 1 and then Planet Data 2, and we feel a real affinity between Cambridge and Leeds on this, especially when we want to catch up, I guess. So if you're going to cast forward not too far, but say into 2021, what do you think is going to happen?
Do you want to pick this one?
What would you like to happen?
Sure. Okay, so my personal little sort of hobby horse is that we should get LSOA aggregated data, so that's lower super output area data for electricity and gas updated on a daily basis. So we've already got data out there for COVID that's done on a similar basis. I kind of feel the climate emergency is, as important. And I would like to bring together people in an open and public way to get this data out there on a daily basis. Because if you can't, my concern is that people put a lot of effort into kind of decarbonizing. If you don't measure where you are at the beginning, it's difficult to know the effect you've actually had. And I think certainly at a community level, it's difficult to motivate communities if they can't see the difference that they've made. So if we can get that localized data, whatever a community will do to decarbonize, they can see the actual impact, and that will help motivate them to do more and more stuff. So I think it's really important to have that localized data.
If I could build on that a little bit, just again, sort of using the COVID analogy, it's right now it's playing out as how hard it is to have a differentiated response depending on the circumstances on the ground. And because of a centralized kind of mass approach, mass measurement, countrywide rollout, I feel like the ability to actually be differentiated according to the circumstances in communities is really hampered. And with climate change interventions, you need a similar level of granularity. What will work in the center of Leeds doesn't work in the Rhondda Valley or wherever it happens to be. It's very different. And so this localized data and local action, if we can build on the idea that the best thing we can do is empower stuff at a very grassroots level, then that would be, that's what 2021 is about. Starting to get this data flowing, get it nice and accurate, nice and timely, and work on getting the action that is prompted by that to be happening on a local level, led by local initiatives that are sensitive to the communities they're existing within.
Fantastic. And I think it's something we've all experienced over the 6 months or 7 months of the COVID-19 pandemic emergency, is that centralized solutions around data don't work, and centralized local solutions delivered from a central point don't work either. And our experience of operating in this is that there's no way that the most centralized country in Europe, or maybe in the world, is not responding well to a complex system that needs nuance, and it needs to be able to deal with what's on its doorstep, not for someone to guess what might be working in a policy paper. So that's amazing, and I think we'd really like to help you on that in 2021. So let's keep that conversation going, and we'd love to share what we know and what you know, and hopefully make a massive difference in 2021. So thanks very much, Stefan and Chris. Really thanks for joining us, and we really enjoyed what you're doing, and hopefully we can build on that in Leeds and share something back to you. So next up is Climate View. We've got Frederick from Climate View, who's joined us from Stockholm. He has built the thing that could measure carbon at the levels that Stefan is talking about. So I'm really excited about this, because I think we can start to see a glimpse of the future about how we can actually communicate this for people and how they can understand. So next up, Frederick from Climate View, over to you.
Hey everyone, this is Frederick from Climate View. Really happy to be here today. So what we do at Climate View is to help cities, regions and nations reach their climate goals. But first of all, what is a climate goal really? Well, let's say that you have a net zero 2030 goal. Of course, this simply means that you need to reduce your emissions by a certain amount by a certain year, in this case 2030. And this leads to one very big question, and that is, of course, how? How are you supposed to reach this goal? One way to reach it is, of course, just to stop doing everything that causes emissions today. We stop driving, we stop heating our homes, we stop basically eating, we stop everything that causes emissions. Now, of course, this might be a solution for some things that we need to stop doing, but for the most part, we would rather need to shift from a high carbon state to a low carbon state, basically doing things differently. So instead of stopping, we shift to something else, something greener. So what would such a shift actually look like? Let's take a concrete example. So let's say that we have emissions from cars in your city, and these of course need to go to zero by 2030. One way to do that is to shift the people who today drive by fossil fueled cars to electric cars. That's one way. And for every such person that we shift, we save around 120 grams of CO2 equivalents per passenger kilometer. That's the key unit here. Another very important shift is, of course, public transport. Shifting people who today drive to work or to school to buses, trams, or metros. That would save us even more. And a third way is, of course, cycling and walking, completely fossil free. So that would be fantastic if we can get someone from a car to a bicycle or to start walking. That would save us 141.9 grams per driven passenger kilometer, according to the UK average. So let's look at one of these shifts in detail to understand what that really means. So let's look at electric cars. But first of all, we have an activity going on in society. So every day we have 40,000 people commuting by car, fossil fueled car in this city. That's the activity. This equals a certain amount of work, in this case 180 million passenger kilometers driven per year by fossil fuel car, which consumes resources, 11 million liters of fossil fuel. This of course leads to emissions, as much as 20,000 tons of CO2 equivalents per year. This we need to shift to something that causes less emissions. So let's assume for a second that we shift all of these people to electric cars. So that would look like this. We still have 40,000 people commuting every day, but now with battery electric vehicles. And of course, this equals the same amount of work, but it would use another type of resource, 33 gigawatt hours of electricity, which causes considerably less emissions, 1.7 thousand tons, if we assume that the grid will decarbonize rapidly over the next 10 years. Now, of course, perhaps it wouldn't be desirable or realistic to shift everyone to electric cars, so let's instead settle for something in between. So let's assume that we manage to shift half of these people, so 20,000 people shifting to battery electric vehicles by 2030, And this would lead to a carbon abatement or carbon avoidance of 9.3 thousand tons of CO2. And each such shift has a clear mathematical logic behind it in the transition target model, and that precisely tracks down the effect basically of this specific shift. And of course, electric vehicles is just one of many shifts, and in total we have mapped out 79 such shifts. And they are universal, they work everywhere, in every society, with cars, with houses, with humans. These are human behaviors we're talking about. These shifts are all measurable, and they're all operationally useful for government, central and local. So this is the framework, and Climate View, the tool, is what we use and what cities use and what nations use to operationalize this framework. So I'll go into the actual tool now and show you how it looks for one of our cities, namely Newcastle. So this is the Climate View dashboard of Newcastle, one of our UK cities. It essentially is the digital and dynamic version of the Net Zero Action Plan of Newcastle. It describes and shows the emissions, or the challenge, which also equals the goal, basically reducing this amount of emissions, 1.5 million tons of CO2 equivalents, to net zero by 2030. The green, that's the targets, the transition targets that need to happen, the shifts that need to happen to reach this goal. And at the bottom are the actions that will take them there. So clicking here in the middle, we enter the dashboard, and we see that transport and energy are the two biggest sources of emissions in the city, and waste here on the right hand side. So if we look at energy, we have here different groups of transition targets. The first one being retrofitting, so improving existing houses. The second one being renewable efficient heating, so changing the heat source of existing and new houses. And finally, renewable electricity production. Let's look at the biggest one, which is renewable and efficient heating. And within this one, we find things like heat pumps, or shift to district heating, or hydrogen blended in the gas mix. But heat pumps here, according to the model and according to the city, represents the biggest potential. So here we distinguish between heat pumps for housing and heat pumps for buildings. Let's look at heat pumps for houses. And the target here is to shift 57% of households to heat pumps by 2030. And at the bottom, we have the actions that are currently in place to quicken up this shift. If we press here on more information, we see a graph, and this shows the carbon abatement of this shift. So if this is successful, if the city succeeds to reach this 57% target, it will save the city this much emissions by 2030. And if I zoom up, you see that all these levels add up, so that we make sure that the city actually reaches its net zero goal. Thank you so much for having me, and feel free to reach out. Here is my email. Hey everyone, this is Frederick from Climate View. Really happy to be here today. So what we do at Climate View is to help cities, regions and nations reach their climate goals. But first of all, what is a climate goal really? Well, let's say that you have a net zero 2030 goal. Of course, this simply means that you need to reduce your emissions by a certain amount by a certain year, in this case 2030. And this leads to one very big question, and that is, of course, how? How are you supposed to reach this goal? One way to reach it is, of course, just to stop doing everything that causes emissions today. We stop driving, we stop heating our homes, we stop basically eating, we stop everything that causes emissions. Now, of course, this might be a solution for some things that we need to stop doing, but for the most part, we would rather need to shift from a high carbon state to a low carbon state, basically doing things differently. So instead of stopping, we shift to something else, something greener. So what would such a shift actually look like? Let's take a concrete example. So let's say that we have emissions from cars in your city, and these of course need to go to zero by 2030. One way to do that is to shift the people who today drive by fossil fueled cars to electric cars. That's one way. And for every such person that we shift, we save around 120 grams of CO2 equivalents per passenger kilometer. That's the key unit here. Another very important shift is, of course, public transport. Shifting people who today drive to work or to school to buses, trams, or metros. That would save us even more. And a third way is, of course, cycling and walking, completely fossil free. So that would be fantastic if we can get someone from a car to a bicycle or to start walking. That would save us 141.9 grams per driven passenger kilometer, according to the UK average. So let's look at one of these shifts in detail to understand what that really means. So let's look at electric cars. But first of all, we have an activity going on in society. So every day we have 40,000 people commuting by car, fossil fueled car in this city. That's the activity. This equals a certain amount of work, in this case 180 million passenger kilometers driven per year by fossil fueled car, which consumes resources, 11 million liters of fossil fuel. This, of course, leads to emissions, as much as 20,000 tons of CO2 equivalents per year. This we need to shift to something that causes less emissions. So let's assume for a second that we shift all of these people to electric cars. So that would look like this. We still have 40,000 people commuting every day, but now with battery electric vehicles. And of course, this equals the same amount of work, but it would use another type of resource, 33 gigawatt hours of electricity, which causes considerably less emissions, 1.7 thousand tons, if we assume that the grid will decarbonize rapidly over the next 10 years. Now, of course, perhaps it wouldn't be desirable or realistic to shift everyone to electric cars, so let's instead settle for something in between. So let's assume that we manage to shift half of these people, so 20,000 people shifting to battery electric vehicles by 2030, and this would lead to a carbon abatement or carbon avoidance of 9.3 thousand tons of CO2. And each such shift has a clear mathematical logic behind it in the transition target model, and that precisely tracks down the effect basically of this specific shift. And of course, electric vehicles is just one of many shifts, and in total we have mapped out 79 such shifts. And they are universal, they work everywhere, in every society, with cars, with houses, with humans. These are human behaviors we're talking about. These shifts are all measurable, and they're all operationally useful for government, central and local. So this is the framework, and Climate View, the tool, is what we use and what cities use and what nations use to operationalize this framework. So I'll go into the actual tool now and show you how it looks for one of our cities, namely Newcastle. So this is the Climate View dashboard of Newcastle, one of our UK cities. It essentially is the digital and dynamic version of the Net Zero Action Plan of Newcastle. It describes and shows the emissions, or the challenge, which also equals the goal, basically reducing this amount of emissions, 1.5 million tons of CO2 equivalents, to net zero by 2030. The green, that's the targets, the transition targets that need to happen, the shifts that need to happen to reach this goal. And at the bottom are the actions that will take them there. So clicking here in the middle, we enter the dashboard, and we see that transport and energy are the two biggest sources of emissions in the city, and waste here on the right hand side. So if we look at energy, we have here different groups of transition targets. The first one being retrofitting, so improving existing houses. The second one being renewable efficient heating, so changing the heat source of existing and new houses. And finally, renewable electricity production. Let's look at the biggest one, which is renewable and efficient heating. And within this one, we find things like heat pumps, or shift to district heating, or hydrogen blended in the gas mix. But heat pumps here, according to the model and according to the city, represents the biggest potential. So Here we distinguish between heat pumps for housing and heat pumps for buildings. Let's look at heat pumps for houses. And the target here is to shift 57% of households to heat pumps by 2030. And at the bottom, we have the actions that are currently in place to quicken up this shift. If we press here on more information, we see a graph, and this shows the carbon abatement of this shift. So if this is successful, if the city succeeds to reach this 57% target, it will save the city this much emissions by 2030. And if I zoom up, you see that all these levels add up so that we make sure that the city actually reaches its net zero goal. Thank you so much for having me, and feel free to reach out. Here is my email.
So thank you, Frederick.
Thank you.
That talk's fascinating. It's definitely the approach that we are looking forward to being completed across many parts of Europe. So the first question for me is just, if you just tell us where you're operating in the UK, what you do in Sweden, and where you're doing in other parts of Europe.
Yeah, sure. So we started out in Sweden, working with the country of Sweden, then starting with a group of pilot cities in Sweden, got really good feedback from the cities. And then during spring, we decided to launch in Europe, starting with the two biggest emitters, UK and Germany. And so during spring and early summer, we started with the first group of UK pilot cities. So we're currently working with Cambridge, Coventry, Dundee, Nottingham, and Newcastle to help them on their climate transition, and also now a group of German cities. Yeah, so that's where we are right now, and preparing to launch in the US next week.
Fantastic, fantastic. And what do you think the benefit that people take around this? I think I know is the move from writing reports around sustainability and carbon emissions and what other people should do to actually doing stuff about it and killing reports. But what are you seeing people use the tool to do to make a difference?
Yeah, so really what the climate challenge is it's a very complex project. It's perhaps the most complex project of all. You have a lot of different things you need to do, and ever-changing environment, lots of different stakeholders to relate to. So it's a very complex project. And even if you publish the best report in the world, it would still become out of date very quickly. And especially if you commission someone else to write the report for you, you might not feel full ownership of it. So it might be difficult to actually implement some of the things internally. So what we're giving them is a way to dynamically work with the same concepts, but in a clear structure and with clear targets that creates basically a full transparency, both within the organization, but also together with external partners, to make sure that everyone are on the same page, that this is what we need to achieve, this is how we can do it, and we need to do it together. So it's a new level of a new kind of transparency, I guess.
Yeah. And how does how are you seeing your tools be used to be published openly on the web, and how does that work?
Yeah, so after a couple of weeks of preparations together with the cities to get all the data in place and most importantly, the actions, all the things the city is doing, after that is in place, we're ready to publish, basically making it available to all. So then it essentially becomes a portal for the city's climate policy. And surprisingly, that's gone surprisingly smoothly, even though it is a radically new type of transparency. Still, I think everyone understands that there is a strong sense of urgency. There is increasing expectations on transparency, and so everyone understands the need for that. So that's the way we do it, open for all to see.
Fantastic. And there's a question in the chat saying what happened with Cambridge, but I understood that you're working with Cambridge to put a climate view together.
Yeah, exactly. So in the case of Cambridge, it's an interesting one there. We're helping them to build, basically create the climate strategy from scratch as a core partner. So that's really, really exciting. We just came out of a workshop with them where we drilled down really deep on cycling. What can we do to really get more people to cycle? Because what it really is about in the case of cycling is to get people who today drive to work to get them to instead use a cycle. That's the group of people we really need to influence and really make it as easy as possible for them to cycle. Even though Cambridge is the #1 cycling city in the UK, there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's still many people who are driving to work. And no matter what the percentage point is on the transition target, the conclusion is always that you definitely need to do more. And there's always more that you can do. Even if you're a non-unitary local authority, there's always more you can do. You can ask other stakeholders to do things for you. Really about creating that sense of urgency and also a spirit of teamwork, that we can do this together.
Fantastic. And just so that people know, if they were working in a city or council in the UK, how much would it cost to use Climate View for their way of measuring emissions and driving the change we need to see to do with the climate emergency?
Yeah, so to make it as fair and accessible as possible, we do it on a resident basis, so number of residents basically defines the cost, and it would typically be around the region of 6 pence per resident. So it would be typically a lot less than many cities would spend on other types of reports and other initiatives that we can complement or replace. So that's essentially how we do it. And we do it, of course, we offer trials to see if it works out, if it fits within the organization, and if it works out for them. So that's it.
And that's a subscription fee that you software, so you just subscribe to the software. Yeah,
it's a software as a service, exactly. But the model itself, the transition target model, and all the everything that is behind that, that's an open data initiative. So we have an open data initiative on the one hand, the transition targets, and then we have the software on the other hand, Climate View, a bit like, I guess, the Mozilla Foundation, or as quite a few other software companies have set it up. And the reason we did that, because we need and want the model to be open, so we can actually we can involve experts leading the academics, but also there have been other companies reaching out and asking to use the model, and that's totally fine by us. The more who use it, the better. So yeah, that's how the setup we've chosen.
I've just calculated what it would cost for Leeds City Region. So there's about 780,000 people in Leeds. That's about £46,000 a year software subscription. And I know that the consultancy work that's been completed has been nearly, has been over 100,000 or maybe 200,000 in the last year or so. So we would get Climate View for 4 or 5 years for the work we spent on the reports that are out of date the minute they're published. So
yeah. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not much, and you can essentially see it as a digital consultant. It's basically have a world-leading analyst with you all the time, and who's continuously improving. We have new updates every week to make the product better, and work really closely with the city to make sure that it's as best as it possibly can be. So yeah, that's how we try to position it as a digital climate officer, if you may.
Yeah, fantastic. So. So Terry's asking a bit more about Cambridge, but I think you've dealt with that, and maybe they can take that offline and maybe contact you online.
Absolutely.
We're really happy that, I'm really glad that you shared your work with us here at ODI Leeds and Climate Data 3. We'll be looking forward to seeing you progress and working with you on the data you're publishing. And obviously, we've all got a burning platform to deal with the climate emergency over the next few years, because it really is a massive change that we need to make for all of us. So, Frederick, if there's anything else you'd like to share with us, please do now.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for having me. And really, the UK is increasingly feeling like our second home. I think it will be our primary home at some point. This is really a fantastic place for us to be. It's such a great ecosystem, and the cities, basically the caliber of the people we're working with, and all the engagement. Also, the engagement from civil society is really unparalleled. We haven't seen that anywhere else. So it's a perfect learning ground for us. Really, we can really try how far we can take this model. We've really just gotten started, really. So it's a fantastic place for us to be, even though it's virtually at the moment, but that works out fine, actually.
And that's really good to hear, because sometimes we beat ourselves up that we're not very good and we're not working out. And I think it sometimes takes someone from the outside to tell you that actually we are making massive progress and we should keep going.
You are. I mean, you're definitely on par with, and sometimes better than, Swedish cities in terms of digitization, and definitely a lot better than German cities. It's still landline for most of the time. So we're struggling a bit on the digital side on Germany, but UK definitely going pretty well. I just wish more cities would use Zoom. Really, Teams does have its limitations.
Well, yeah, and we're live on the website as well, so there's no sign in or anything. If people want to join us, that's part of our transition to an online only event space as well as being in person. So
yeah.
Hopefully, Frederick, we'll see you soon, and it's been great to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Next up, we've got, and this goes really well, is that we've got Simon Pringle from the Leeds City Region LEP. And he's going to talk about his personal view around the climate emergency and what's going on in Leeds, and what he thinks we need to do next. So Simon's next, and then we've got a Q&A.
Hello, everybody. My name is Simon Pringle. I run a company called Project Rome. I'm also Professor of Sustainability and Innovation at Chester University. But for the purposes of this, I've got my Leeds City Region hat on, and I chair the Green Economy panel. And what I'm going to be sharing with you in a moment are some slides that we're using to explain the pathways work that we've been doing from a decarbonisation point of view. So the carbon reduction pathways study was instructed by the Combined Authority. The Combined Authority, along with its partner councils, declared a climate emergency in July 2019, and along with lots of other authorities, of course. And it took the opportunity to strengthen its emissions reduction ambition at the same time. So it's now aiming to be net zero carbon by 2038, but importantly to have made really significant progress by 2030. The carbon emissions reduction pathway study was commissioned to enable an understanding of how we were actually going to do that in practice. What could West Yorkshire do to reach the ambition? Now, it doesn't go as far as answering which specific measures, policies or actions should be implemented. That's been considered as part of the one of the key areas for the infrastructure framework and some of the next phases of work. But it does look at the different scenarios under which the net carbon by 2038 could be achieved, and there's going to be more on that on future slides. So there are several key messages from task one from this piece of work. First one is that West Yorkshire could meet its target. You'll see there's a range of measures been identified in the study to achieve the emissions reductions between 73 and 82%. And there's a range provided because they relate to the different outputs from the three different pathways or scenarios. Remaining emissions, clearly that doesn't deliver 100%, so the remaining emissions delivered through a combination of increasing our ambitions in certain areas, such as tree planting, higher levels of remote working, and perhaps the fact we're all joining this virtually and the experience we've had through COVID means we might have been a little under ambitious, given that this work was done pre-COVID in that area, or supporting on the deployment of innovative technologies. Now, what we're keen to stress there, of course, is that we're not banking on a silver bullet, banking on a technology that doesn't yet exist. What we're really talking about are technologies that are not fully commercial right now, but in the course of events, we may be able to deploy them. There's a number of common deployment levels across all three of the pathways that have been modelled to put West Yorkshire on the pathway to net zero. For example, 675,000 homes are going to need to be retrofitted to energy performance standard C or better, regardless of the pathway. But also to fully achieve our ambition, we're going to need government to intervene both on a financial and a policy support level. So, for example, in areas around the decarbonisation of heat or the decarbonisation of aviation. Baseline, and this relates to the current situation in West Yorkshire. What you'll be able to see very quickly there, the green and purple blocks, is that we're dominated by transport and buildings. For the transport side of things, the road transport elements, cars, vans and HGVs, make up the very much largest share, with the non-road transport, aviation, being the only real contributor there. Buildings, well, they're roughly split 2/3, 1/3 between domestic and non-domestic, and that's going to cover flats and homes, of course, of different types, and then offices and commercial premises. The majority of that comes from natural gas being burnt for heating water or heating the space. Now, the industry is relatively modest on that, and that is because West Yorkshire doesn't have the same intensity of industrial activity that, for example, Teesside, Humberside, the Wirral might have with their chemical plants or processing and so on. We've got a lot of glass making, and there's a lot of light industry or medium industry, but not heavy industry. So the energy intensity is much lower. And then the agricultural and land use emissions, relatively small, but that's because of the characteristic nature of the region. And we've included waste as well, so that it's there for completion. So we've modelled 4 pathways, they've been modelled by the study rather, and we're calling these baseline, max ambition, high hydrogen and balanced. The baseline one, that is to demonstrate how quickly the region could decarbonise using policies that are already in place, commitments that have already been made. So it's not a business as usual pathway, but it's a no additional policy intervention, no additional commitments pathway. You'll imagine, I'll show you soon, that that doesn't get us anywhere near where we need to be. Max ambition, totally the opposite end. That is really looking at what we could do if we pulled every lever available to us. And high hydrogen is also a very ambitious pathway, but it looks at the decarbonisation of heat through a major hydrogen rollout, and that is the significant sort of element of that pathway. Again, I'll show you the detail. And then the balanced one, as you'd infer, that is a balanced mix of the different technologies looking at the decarbonisation. It involves hydrogen, electrification, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, decentralised energy production, all the different things. So it's got a real cross-section in there. Okay. So here's the baseline. This is the existing commitments pathway. And up in that oval in the top right corner, you can see that the reduction from the current position is only 32%. So really doesn't get us terribly far. All of the sectors there show change, but slow change to switch to low carbon heat, transport and other practices. Transport sector sees the most progress, but that's really due to the faster development of technology-ready, cost-effective solutions, and leading to uptakes of the uptake of electrical vehicles and so on. The majority of emissions in the buildings and industry sector, that's due to the decarbonisation of the national electricity grid. So that's not really interventions we're making locally, that's reduction in carbon grid mix, as we call it. There's a relatively slow uptake in low carbon heat due to high costs, low awareness, and consumer behaviour challenges. And the agriculture and land use emissions, modest though they are in comparison, do actually grow a little bit because there's an expectation of greater intensity of use and pressure for food output. Power sector down by 26%, and that's really an efficiency improvement based on energy from waste and still phasing out some of the fossil generation. And the remaining emissions at the end, obviously pretty much mirroring where we were to begin with, dominated by the buildings and the transport sector. So that's not terribly exciting. The next one is electricity-led decarbonisation. This is the one we were calling the max ambition approach before. What that shows is the 82% reduction. So that's the most full sort of end of our range. All sectors see rapid change, requiring strong incentives for consumers and for businesses to switch to low carbon heat, transport and other practices. The remaining emissions in 2038 are primarily in transport and buildings, although both sectors see significant electricity usage, so they're going to decarbonise further as the national grid decarbonises. Transport sector, rapid uptake in EVs, alongside a significant shift in consumer journeys and increase in active and public transport. The building sector is seeing a very ambitious rollout of heat pumps, We think around 665,000 of them in domestic systems by 2038, and heat networks, particularly between 2025 and 2035. So we've always got some of those in the region, but there would be a significant increase. And large-scale building efficiency retrofits within this decade, within the 2020s. Industry focusing on developing new technology and switching to low-carbon fuels and hydrogen available to select industry sites through dedicated power lines, pipelines rather. And the power sector seeing a rapid rollout of solar PV, onshore wind, energy from waste and carbon capture and storage within the next decade by 2030. And this is quite a similar one, but it's got a very significant led decarbonisation, slightly less progress made, 76% rather than 82%. All sectors seeing a rapid change, yes, partly enabled by transition from natural gas to hydrogen to be used in hydrogen boilers, vehicles, power generation. So hydrogen conversion is a significant infrastructure challenge. There's a lot of work being led by our colleagues in Northern Gas Networks and Cadent, both here in this region and elsewhere, particularly across the north of England. Transport sector seeing significant uptake of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, particularly in the heavy goods sector with buses as the large vehicles. Although the assumption is that battery electric cars will be a significant share of the vehicle fleet, the lighter vehicle fleet, and a shift in journey to active and public transport still occurring gradually between now and 2038. And when we talk about active transport, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with that phrase, that just really means walking and cycling. So that's very positive from a health point of view as well. Buildings and industry sectors, heavy reliance on the conversion of natural gas grid to hydrogen by 2038 for that low carbon heat. 2020s, we'd expect to see hybrid heat pumps and energy efficiency measures being implemented. And then by 2038, over 500,000 homes heated by hydrogen. Power sector and land use, pretty much the same as the previous pathway, previous scenario. And if a mix of technologies are adopted, well, 73%, so really not dissimilar to the hydrogen intervention. Significant electrification of heat and transport, introduction of hydrogen, some areas of the gas grid enabling hydrogen boilers, but not quite as full a transformation as the last scenario. Progress slower than in other pathways, particularly in the land use sector, because that's broadly down to an uncertainty as to how things can be deployed. The transport sector, mixed rollout, hydrogen electrical, same thing for buildings, and again, similar for power and for land use. So really taking elements of both of the previous pathways and blending them together, that's what we're looking at here. So here's the last slide. This is about, it is a comparison, so how do they compare to each other side by side, and what are the differences? Well, the 2030s, we can see that there are significant emissions remaining. The max ambition pathway, making the most progress through ambitious uptake of active travel, electrical vehicles, heat pumps. Industry has made limited progress by 2030 due to the immature state of certain low carbon technologies. And by 2038, the majority of the remaining emissions come from transport and buildings. So a key challenge there is the stock turnover rate when people actually replace fleets or upgrade buildings and so on. And of course, this is about us improving what we're already doing, making things less bad. What we haven't been able to design in here are the choices that we could make that would take us in a different direction. And clearly we are really advocating that we don't make high carbon choices going forwards. Emissions to reduce still further across all of these scenarios outside of our control, but if the overall electricity grid goes carbon zero by 2038. So there we are. That was a really quick blast through. As I say, this is being shared with industry groups and different sectors at the moment, and to get their input and their thoughts and ideas as to how we take some of these pathways and scenarios and decarbonise in practice. You're going to be able to ask some questions later. I'll try my best to answer any of those, but also really open to your ideas, feedback, thoughts and perspectives too. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks Simon, that's fantastic, and it really shows the work's been done in this part of the world to make a difference and deal with the climate emergency. So We've still got some questions coming through on the chat. I'm just looking at them now. And from my point of view, as a resident of Leeds, what would we see happening over the next 6, 12, 18 months, maybe 5 years' time that will make a difference? And how can we get involved as individuals or business owners in this part of the world?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. Yeah. Well, as you'd have seen from the slides that I shared, we're currently in the process of really trying to map through those different trajectories, and the ones that we adopt will influence what people see. And of course, it's going to be influenced by the amount of funding that's unlocked as well. As with a lot of things, there'll be quite a lot that is happening almost behind the scenes or out of the public gaze in the first instance around preparatory works and enabling works and infrastructure and so on. But what we will begin to see, and we'll begin to see within the relatively short period, is supporting infrastructure for different types of transport, choices that we make in terms of setting priorities around transport between perhaps public transport and active transport, and what gets primacy in that sort of setting. Different choices around land use and looking at areas that we can actually plant more trees and bringing that down to a community level as well. Really beginning to understand how we can start addressing this agenda at different scales. And it really is a question of scale. So there will be some things that only really make sense on a fully regional level, way beyond West Yorkshire Combined Authority. Hydrogen is a really good example of that. You can't do that locally. That's a big ticket, big lever issue. Whereas other things only really make sense if they're done on a community scale, where local authorities might enable or support mini parklets or planters or different types of taking certain amounts of parking away to repurpose the road space, and so there'll be interventions happening at different scales, some of which will be more visible depending on what people do. And in terms of what people can do themselves, well, I'm sure there are some of the lifestyle issues that are associated with climate are going to be well known by many on this call. The way that we travel and what we consume, both in terms of products that we buy, but also the food that we eat, those are the points of intervention that are most immediately obvious and easiest to address as individuals. But it's legitimate to say that the most important thing we can do about addressing the climate emergency is talk to people about it, is actually engage with it, express a perspective, be a little bit more activist as a corporate, be a bit more activist as an organization, and really try and drive change within that particular sphere of influence. And so I think probably what we will experience more of as residents or people who come into West Yorkshire to work is a heightened level of engagement, and engagement via channels that previously haven't really been used. So through the arts, through the creative industries, not just through education and not just through corporate networks that have a risk of preaching to the choir a little bit. It's about opening that out into to a much wider level of engagement with civic society that hasn't happened to any significant extent yet, and it has to happen quickly if we're going to build the momentum.
Brilliant, thanks very much. And I have to ask this.
Yes.
It's ODI Leeds and we're about the data.
Of course.
How can we expect to be seeing more data being developed by those projects, Combined Authority and the people who are working on those projects?
Yeah, absolutely. There's got to be, and I think the data side of this, which is not my personal area of expertise, as you well know, but in order to inform our decisions and inform the trade-offs, a lot of this is going to be about trade-offs, trading off climate action against economic interventions, trading off social priorities against environmental priorities, trading off the car against public transport, against active transport, land use choices, which are always trade-offs. The land is, it's finite. What you do with it is a trade-off choice. And those are complicated decisions to make. They're complicated decisions to cost across not just financial capital, but other capitals, social capital and environment, natural capital and so on. And so that has to be data-driven, or at least enabled by the data. Now, how we do that, I'm sure there are people in this room right now who've got a really strong idea, and I'd love to hear those ideas because I don't know. But getting it into the public domain and allowing it to inform the choices that we're going to need to make, so that it's transparent and that it reinforces the engagement. It stops it becoming polarized, because one of the risks we end up facing perhaps is car lobby versus active transport lobby, afforestation lobby versus farming community, whatever. There are obvious there's an obvious potential for tribalism around some of these choices, and making it as transparent as possible has got to be the way forwards.
Fantastic. Well, I just had an idea for Planet Data 4 actually as we were speaking, and I think what we might do is try and make in 6 months' time, do a data-focused Planet Data 4, all about the data that's available around this part of the world, and so that might be something we could take offline and maybe take forward. Is how do we do that? What do we answer the questions? And also, getting really good data in people's hands can dampen those fires of the black and white conversation about for and against cars. I mean, I've got a car and a bike.
Yeah, exactly. Of course you have. Of course you have.
Roads versus rail. It's a complex system, and the more information we have, and I think we saw with the Climate View way of doing things is putting together data in a usable way, but also in the way that people expect. The way that the web has increased people's expectations about how they can access, use, and share data has given a massive change to the way that we engage with people, and it's no longer in a church hall where we have a consultation. It's doing things on the web and using the web as it was intended.
That's right.
Try and control the message.
And I think certainly one of the things we've experienced over the last 6 months is an acceleration of a trajectory we were already on in terms of the way that people were willing to engage in that way, I think. And I think your point about bringing together those different influences around where the data that already exists is, I'll gladly take that offline with you. I don't know the full answer, but I know where some of it is, and we can make a start on that if you like. Informing those decisions is key, because I don't know if it came across in those slides. I was rattling through it quite a pace to try and get across the information for everyone, so apologies for that. But it's not just about making that which we already do less bad. It's also about informing ourselves so we don't make choices that will make it worse. And there are certain things that we could decide to do, which would push us in the wrong direction and make it harder to achieve those percentage figures I'm pointing at some slides. I don't know why I'm doing that, sorry. Harder to achieve those percentages that are in there rather than easier. So it cuts in both directions. It's also about, decarbonising what we do and what we've got, but also making wise choices, truly wise choices about how we grow the economy locally and regionally as well.
Fantastic. So I think you've got away with the main bits are about open data saves lives, which is a separate piece of work that we're doing. But I think you got away with any specific questions. But I do think we may have landed on the what we're going to talk about Planet Data 4. The combined authority, Leeds City Council, Bradford Council, Calderdale Council are sponsors of ODI Leeds. That would make a really good session about that. And I'd like to say, on a personal note, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thanks on behalf of everyone who's joined us. So yeah, thanks, Simon. And if there's anything else you'd like to just share with us before we go?
No, other than any thoughts or feedback that you have in terms of the trajectories that you saw me explaining earlier. I, on behalf of the Green Economy Panel of the LEP and the Combined Authority, I don't actually work for either, but just here with that hat on, we'd love to hear it. This is a period of engagement. The engagement at the moment is sector focused with industry leaders across buildings, transportation, industry, land use, and so on. But there's no reason why we shouldn't widen that. So if you do have perspectives and thoughts and can perhaps channel them in via the ODI team, they will be, gladly received.
Fantastic. And Sheridan's just asked what extent have we've decided on what are the pathways. I think what you're saying is that at the moment it's consultation and a blend. Many pathways are being considered at the moment. So I think there's a
yeah, that's right, Sheridan. Absolutely. So if you've got a view on it, share your view, and it will go into the mix. Absolutely, it will. I mean, some of those pathways, it's outside of our immediate control as to whether we can embark upon them. For example, the hydrogen-rich pathway, that depends upon a big decision being taken outside of this. It's a Westminster decision, and then it's a kind of institutional funding choice. But you know, if you want to express a preference for that because of, or you think actually we should be going for a minimum approach, you know, whatever, it's an entirely open consultation, and we're being fully transparent. So share your views.
And I'd like to say thank you. So thanks again, Simon. And what we're going to do next is we're going to, we've now got Duncan McIntyre from Yorkshire Water, who's another sponsor of ODI Leeds, but also a major player in the way in which this part of the world, West Yorkshire, operates, and talk about how they're using data and how they work together. So next up is Duncan. I'm really looking forward to this. And then we're finished. Thank you.
Hi there, how are you doing? My name is Duncan McIntyre, and today I'm going to be taking you through one of our snapshot reports that we are producing here at Yorkshire Water to give you a better idea of what we do and how we do it. In a moment, I'll show you my screen and show you the slide deck that I'll be taking you through. And in that, you'll be able to see our specialist theme for the month, which is water in the home. What you'll notice about the presentation today is that we are bringing this to you from a web format, and that's slightly different to how we've previously done these sorts of things. Power BI is the software that we use, and in particular we are focusing on our performance commitments that support how we consume water, how we interact with it, and how we respond to you when those things don't go according to plan. So as you can see here, we've got our little snapshot report here on water in the home. And within this, you'll be able to see that this is performance related to our 2018-19 annual performance review. And during that time, we had 26 performance commitments. Obviously, now we've moved into AMP7, which for some customers who don't necessarily know what that is our 2020 to 2025 reporting period. And what you can see within this is not just how much water has been used, but also how that looks across a full year. And the purpose of this is to show you not only whether we achieve the targets, but how customer interactions with our water influences whether we meet those targets as well. So our targets for consumption in 18-19 was 133.5 litres per head per day, which is in layman's terms how much water each of us uses. But as you can see on the graph, this tends to fluctuate across the full year, peaking in July at around 166 litres per person per day. And all this information is on the data mill, by the way. It's saved in the CSV format and it's really accessible. So if you want to replicate this information, then you're more than welcome to do so. The other thing that we've been able to identify is that there are different measures depending on whether you have a meter or not. So this factors in our unmeasured households as well as measured households. If you're wanting to know the splits between the two, then feel free to reach out to us and we'll see what we can get for you. As well as across the seasons, you can see it against household type as well. So for this one, we can see, depending on whether you're a 3-person property or a 4-person property, how that fluctuates over the year. So for us, there is a subtle adjustment in June and July as that peaks, and that's reflected across different household types. But it's more severe in certain ones than others. So in single property households, the peak is a little bit more severe. And you can also see as well, once you click into there, how that changes according to that property type. So you can see here there's an average bar level, which we saw previously, but for single person households, the per capita consumption is that much higher as an average. And that's because there's less people in that household to effectively share the water that we take for granted when we're bathing, when we're cleaning, just when we're going about our daily business. And that's interesting to note. So if you are a single person occupant and you are curious as to why there are higher consumptions for you than others, then that's the reason. It's because it's measured using PCC. There is another measure called total daily flow, which measures how much water goes into the property, and it doesn't take into account the number of people in that property, but Ofwat have recommended that we use PCC. The other things that we can talk about are around our contacts as well. So we have obviously call centres that respond to customer queries, and we in 1819 did get around 8,000 customer contacts with regards to our water quality, and that can differ depending on what those queries are relative to. But we can also identify some trends in that, and we can also understand how much of those are attributed to certain regions in our area. So as you can see in this graph here, as a top down, the main cities stand out as the ones that receive the most amount of contacts. Sheffield and Leeds tend to share the top mantle for a number of contacts, and then it tends to stagger down. And what you'll tend to find is that as you click on each of them, they will show you not only how many calls were registered, but during which months they were registered as well. So that gives you an indication on whether there was any particular months that a certain area peaked in water quality contacts. So for example, here we had 185 water quality contacts associated to Sheffield, attributed to Sheffield. And you can click on these graphs as well, so that they can show you which elements are relevant for you. So if you are wanting to understand the makeup of this particular metric, it will show you straight away up here in the Doncaster column. The other elements that I think are pertinent to us are around water quality, and it's really important that customers understand how many samples we actually take during the typical year, and what we test them against. So we test them against over 50 different samples, including E. coli and coliforms, and other metrics as well, which aren't as critical to public health. But just in short, the water quality is up to standard. And we have an ambitious target of 100%, which we just about missed. In 1819, we achieved 99.962%, which down to decimal places of threes isn't too bad. And just to put that into perspective, a pass rate of 0.9995 would require 5 failed samples in every 10,000 tested, or 1 failed sample in every 2,000 tested. And we've been able to map that as well, so you can see the proportion of those samples against each of the different regions. And again, you can see how that reflects across each of the different cities and towns, and the relative scores of those as well. So for Barnsley, for example, we had 4,500 samples tested with a 100% pass rate, so none of them failed in Barnsley. And you can take a look at this and you can kind of figure out what it means to you as well. And you can drill into the map as well, and you can click on the area that's of interest to you, and it will bring that detail up for you as well. I hope that's a really decent little snapshot of some of the things that we're doing to raise the openness and transparency in our business. And we are hoping to do the same with our 1920 data and build some trend analysis into it as well. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Duncan. That was great. It really shows how one of our sponsors is using data and actually taking its own advice, I guess. And we've got 2 questions really. So one is, how are you seeing the use of data and the drive to become open affecting people who are working within Yorkshire Water? And then the second thing we'd like to ask you is, how are you seeing the operations of Yorkshire Water in this part of the world change in response to the climate emergency?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Welcome to everyone. I've been on this open data journey for a couple of years now, since we announced it in February 18, and I think as with a lot of large public and private organisations, there is a reticence towards sharing data, kind of misinterpreting it as kind of business intelligence that is only fit for that company. And I think, you know, we've seen a very gradual shift in culture, in mindsets within our business, from kind of protectionist to kind of not just promoting what we do kind of behind the scenes, but also, you know, how we're delivering it and how our performance is being portrayed and perceived externally, and trying to build that trust up as well. So, you know, we went on that journey, you know, earlier last year, and committed to being open by default by the end of this year, which, you know, to all intents and purposes, we've achieved. I don't believe that we've anywhere near scratched the surface in terms of seeing the benefits of that yet, but we are certainly starting to see a change in the way in which SMEs and data owners and business owners are challenging themselves on what they can do to drive down performance. And as well as it's been a bit of a journey to presenting this data back to our business and demonstrating how we can work smarter to identify where there's potential gaps or weaknesses in our operations through an open data approach. People don't necessarily think that that's the end goal. You know, they think that it's just a case of just being transparent for transparency's sake, but it really isn't. It's very much got innovation at the heart of it. And I think, you know, when we look at our open data ambitions and we look at how we can dovetail that into the climate emergency, which is obviously upon us right now, myself having watched the witness statement from David Attenborough early in the week, and it being very much at the fore that, you know, as an individual and as a business level, we need to put this at the top of our agendas. It's around how each of the little micro elements of our operation as our business have a subsequent impact on whether it's carbon emissions or whether it is generally weather related, you know, climate change and all the good stuff around that. You know, there was a great talk earlier around slow the flow, and, you know, we are very much promoting, you know, those initiatives, and moving into next quarter and moving into the next couple of years. You know, people might not realize that we have net zero ambitions as well as everyone else, you know, by 2030, as ambitious as that is. And looking at all the individual components of our operation. And if we can bring those elements, those data sets, whether they're static or telemetered or dynamic, and we can push them out there, we can help to solve those issues much better and collaboratively. And I think we want to move towards that point where, you know, the people running the businesses on a day-to-day basis are taking ownership of that data and saying we want to put it out there because we're seeing the benefit from it. So next year, I think we're definitely going to see more of that. We are in talks at the moment around visualizing and bringing to life the data that we own and create and collect on a daily basis more publicly, both through our social channels, but also through our website. And I think that in itself will be a massive catalyst for just opening up that conversation really amongst our teams and our business leaders.
Okay, so I guess what we can take from that is it's we're now in a very positive situation in terms of data and open data and at Yorkshire Water. So that's great. And in terms of the planet data and the climate emergency, what's happening with Yorkshire Water in the future? I mean, I've seen that you've got a massive windmill. You're establishing a port in the most the in Leeds, which is furthest away from the sea. Are there any other bits of news you could share with us about what Yorkshire Water's doing to address the climate emergency?
There's nothing that I could, because I'm not obviously a specialist in the subject matter. I'm more focusing on the open data. But I think if you wanted more information, you can take a look on our website. Our APR, which is our annual performance report, was released only in July this year, and it details not only what our ambitions are and what our impacts are for the forthcoming year, but also how the likes of COVID have fundamentally changed our approach and our considerations in terms of making these decisions. I think, there are some profound implications from that, which will ultimately fast track our approaches to reducing carbon, decarbonizing areas, and also, bringing to life some of the green initiatives that we are putting together at the moment. So it's very much a watch this space and keep in touch.
Fantastic. Well, thanks very much, Duncan. Thanks so much for contributing and also being a critical friend and partner of ODI Leeds and the rest of the sponsors as we try and make a difference. So yeah, thank you, and thanks very much on a personal point for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's up to me now to close the Planet Data 3. Planet Data 3 is part of the work that ODI Leeds are doing around the climate emergency. It's very close to our hearts, and it's part of our mission that we're doing that. And we'll be continuing to work on collecting data, convening people, bringing people together to address what is a massive emergency for us. It's really important that we deal with, but we also know that it's really complex, and sometimes it's very hard to understand what the best thing is to do and how we help. So we've got a number of projects that are happening that we'll be sharing with you and hoping people will join in with. I think we've just decided what Planet Data 4 is going to be all about, and it's going to be all about creating really great data infrastructure for this part of the world in Leeds. And obviously we'll get other people involved, but it's going to be about can we create that data, helping people to share that data and publish it, and building really great tools so that people can engage with that data. So thank you very much for listening and joining us. We're really happy that our sponsors and our speakers have joined us today. And in a socially distanced world, we like to give everyone a round of applause, and thanks very much for joining us. So thank you. Goodbye.